The day Annie Wells walked into the sheriff's office in Harlan Creek, Texas, the temperature was pushing past 94 degrees. The dust was hanging in the air like a second skin, and she had absolutely nothing left to lose. It was the summer of 1882, and the town of Harlan Creek sat on the edge of the Texas hill country like a stubborn old mule that refused to move no matter how hard the wind pushed at it. The main street was a single stretch of hard-packed earth lined with a general store, a livery stable, a saloon that saw more trouble than it ever should have, a small church that saw less redemption than it needed, and a handful of other buildings that existed simply because someone had decided they ought to. The whole town smelled of horse leather and cedar wood and sun-baked clay, and the people who lived there were the kind of people who had come to stay, who had sunk their roots deep into the cracked Texas soil and refused to be moved by anything short of the hand of God itself. Annie Wells was 28 years old, and she had the kind of face that made people look twice without quite knowing why. Not because she was a flashy woman, because she was anything but. She wore a plain calico dress the color of faded cornflowers, her dark brown hair pulled back in a practical knot at the base of her neck, and her boots were the ones her late husband Robert had always teased her about keeping too long past their best years. She had gray-green eyes that held a steadiness in them that most people in Harlan Creek had never been able to quite meet for long, not because there was anything cold in them, but because there was something honest in them that made liars uncomfortable and proud men fidget. Robert Wells had been dead for 4 months. He had died of a fever that swept through the farming settlement south of Harlan Creek in the early spring of 1882, taking him in 9 days, which was 9 days longer than the doctor had expected given the severity of it. He had left behind Annie, their 7-year-old son Thomas, a small ranch house that needed a new roof, 40 acres of decent grazing land, and a debt to the Harlan Creek Town Bank that Annie had not known existed until the bank's representative, a thin, reedy man named Mr. Horace Finch, had appeared on her doorstep 2 weeks after Robert's funeral with papers in his hand and regret on his face that she suspected was mostly practiced. The debt was for $230. Robert had borrowed against the land to buy cattle the previous fall, cattle that had arrived sick and been quarantined and subsequently died, and he had not told Annie about the loan because Robert Wells, God rest his soul, had been a proud man who believed that financial troubles were a husband's burden to carry alone. Annie had spent the last 4 months trying to understand the full shape of the situation she found herself in, and the shape was not good. But there was something else. Something she had discovered quite by accident 3 weeks ago, while going through Robert's papers in the old tin box he kept under the floorboards in the bedroom. There had been a promissory note, handwritten and signed, indicating that one Gerald Marsh, a cattle broker who operated out of San Antonio and occasionally worked through Harlan Creek, owed Robert Wells $115 for the sale of 12 horses that Robert had delivered to Marsh's man in the winter of 1881. The note was dated and witnessed, and according to everything Annie could reason out, Gerald Marsh had never paid that debt. $115 would not cover everything she owed the bank, but it would cover a significant enough portion that she might have time to arrange the rest. And more immediately, it represented money that was rightfully hers, money that belonged to the estate of Robert Wells, money that she and Thomas had every moral and legal right to collect. The problem was that Gerald Marsh had not responded to the 2 letters Annie had sent him. The problem was that Annie had no way to reach San Antonio herself with a young boy and a ranch to look after. And the problem was that Gerald Marsh had, according to the general store owner Mrs. Patton, been through Harlan Creek just last week on business and had made no attempt whatsoever to settle his debt. Which was why Annie Wells was walking across the main street of Harlan Creek at 10:30 in the morning on a Tuesday in July, with the promissory note folded in her dress pocket, and a calm, absolute determination in her step that parted the small crowd of townspeople on the boardwalk the way a good horse parts tall grass. She pushed open the door of the sheriff's office and walked in. The room smelled of coffee and pine wood and something like boot polish, and it was marginally cooler than the street outside, which was its only architectural virtue. There was a heavy oak desk in the center of the room, a gun rack on the wall, a small iron stove in the corner that was doing nothing in this heat, two cells visible through a barred door at the back, and behind the desk sat the sheriff of Harlan Creek. His name was Clayton Ford. Annie knew who he was in the way that everyone in a town of 800 souls knows the sheriff. She had seen him at church on the occasional Sunday when she and Robert had made the trip into town, had seen him managing the rough edges of Harlan Creek's various saloon disputes and boundary arguments, with a quiet competence that people talked about with the specific admiration reserved for things they had come to take for granted. Clayton Ford had been the sheriff of Harlan Creek for 4 years. He was 32 years old, tall enough that he had to angle himself slightly sideways coming through most door frames, with dark hair that was a little too long to be entirely respectable, and a jaw that looked like it had been carved out of the same Texas limestone that built the bluffs east of town. He had dark brown eyes that could be warm and could be absolutely unreadable depending on what the situation required, and right now they were looking up from the papers on his desk with a mixture of mild surprise and immediate attention as Annie walked through his door. He stood up. In 1882, a man stood up when a woman entered a room, and Clayton Ford would have stood up regardless of the year. "Mrs. Wells," he said. His voice was lower than she had expected, with a measured quality to it, unhurried. "Sheriff Ford," she said, and she reached into her pocket and placed the promissory note on his desk with the same directness that she did everything. "I have come to ask for your help collecting a debt that is owed to my late husband's estate. The man who owes it is Gerald Marsh. He was in town last week. He knows what he owes and he is avoiding payment, and I cannot let that stand." Clayton looked at the note without picking it up. Then he looked at her. She did not look away. "Sit down, Mrs. Wells," he said, and he moved around to pull the chair from against the wall and place it in front of the desk for her before sitting back down himself. She sat. She folded her hands in her lap. "Tell me about the debt," he said, and he picked up the note then, reading it with the careful attention of a man who read documents slowly enough to actually understand them. So Annie told him. She told him about Robert's horse sale, about the promissory note, about the 2 unanswered letters, about Gerald Marsh's presence in Harlan Creek the week before, about the bank debt that was pressing down on her situation with the weight of a stone, and the patience of a creditor who knew that patience was the same as power. She told him about Thomas, who was 7 years old and currently staying with their neighbor Mrs. Calder, while Annie made this trip into town. She told him about the 40 acres and the ranch house with the leaking roof. She did not dramatize any of it. She simply laid it out in the honest, exact way that she laid out everything, and when she was done, she was quiet and waited. Clayton Ford looked at the promissory note for a long moment after she stopped speaking. Then he set it down on the desk between them and looked at her with an expression that was neither pitying nor dismissive, which was enough to make Annie exhale a breath she had not entirely realized she was holding. "This note is legitimate," he said. "Witnessed and dated, and I know Gerald Marsh's reputation well enough to believe he'd try to wait a widow out rather than honor what he owes." "I know he would," Annie said, "which is why I am here. I can send a formal written notice to Marsh in San Antonio. I have the authority to notify him that a legal debt is being pursued and that he is required to appear or send payment. That's the cleanest way to handle it within the law. How long would that take? Could be 6 weeks, could be more." Annie was quiet for a moment. "I have perhaps 3 months before the bank begins serious proceedings against the property. 6 weeks is manageable if the outcome is certain." "Nothing in law is certain," Clayton said carefully. "But a witnessed promissory note for a specific amount with both parties named, and a service rendered that can be corroborated is about as close to certain as it gets. Marsh would be a fool to fight it in any court in Texas. And if he chooses to be a fool, Clayton almost smiled. It was a very contained expression, barely a shift at the corners of his mouth, but Annie caught it. Then the court makes him less of one, he said. In my experience, men like Marsh don't actually want the trouble of a legal fight. They take advantage of the fact that widows and smaller creditors assume they can't afford the fight. When they find out you're serious, they tend to settle. Annie looked at him steadily. I am very serious. I believe you, Clayton said, and there was nothing performative in it, no condescension, no overly careful sympathy. He simply said it as a fact that he had assessed and concluded. He pulled a piece of paper from his desk drawer and began to write. He wrote for several minutes while Annie sat in the chair and looked around the office with the quiet observational habit of someone who has spent a great deal of time alone and learned to find interest in the details of rooms. There was a map of the hill country pinned to the wall with various marks on it that she could not read from this distance. There was a coffee cup on the corner of the desk that was still half full and had been sitting long enough to be cold. There was a small framed photograph on the shelf behind him, turned at an angle she could not quite make out. There was a law book on the edge of the desk so worn that its spine had separated and been tied back with a piece of leather cord. I'll need a copy of this note, Clayton said without looking up from his writing. Do you object to leaving it with me for a few days? I made a copy before I came, Annie said. The original is yours to work with. He did look up then. Something shifted in his expression, some small recalibration, as though he was updating an initial assessment. That was good thinking, he said. I have a son to take care of, she said simply. Good thinking is not optional. He finished the letter to Marsh and a separate document that outlined the legal basis of the claim, and he told Annie that he would have both sent from the telegraph office to Marsh's address in San Antonio by end of day, along with a notice that failure to respond within 30 days would result in the matter being referred to the county court in a formal capacity. He explained each step in enough detail that she understood it without it feeling like he was explaining it to someone he thought was ignorant. And she asked 2 sharp questions that he answered directly without making her feel that the questions were inconvenient. When they were done, she stood and he stood with her. I appreciate your help, Sheriff, she said. She meant it without ceremony. It's my job, he said. Then, with a slight pause that she noticed, though I'd like to help beyond the job if I can. If Marsh gives you any trouble, any personal kind of pressure to drop this, you come back and tell me. Annie looked at him for a moment. People in 1882 did not generally make such offers without some awareness of what they were offering, and she was not naive enough to mistake the statement for pure professional courtesy. But neither was it anything she could object to, because it was also simply decent. I will, she said. Good day, Sheriff Ford. Good day, Mrs. Wells, he said, and he was still standing when she walked out the door. The heat hit her like a flat hand when she stepped back onto the main street of Harlan Creek, but she felt something lighter in her chest than she had felt in 4 months, and she was careful not to examine it too closely in case it proved to be more fragile than she needed it to be. She collected Thomas from Mrs. Calder's house at the edge of town, a warm-eyed woman who pressed a wrapped piece of cornbread into Thomas's hands and squeezed Annie's shoulder, and said nothing because she was the kind of person who understood that some silences were kinder than any words available. Thomas was a boy who looked exactly like his father in the eyebrows and the chin, and nothing like him in temperament, being quieter and more watchful than Robert had ever been. He walked beside his mother out of town with the serious attention of a child who had learned in the past 4 months that the world required more caution than it had before. Did the sheriff help you? Thomas asked as they walked the 2-mile road back to the ranch. He is going to try, Annie said. Is he a good sheriff? Annie considered this. He seems to be, she said. Thomas was quiet for a bit. Papa said he was. He said Sheriff Ford was the best thing that had happened to Harlan Creek in a decade. Annie looked at her son for a moment with the particular ache of hearing a living child repeat the words of a dead man with such casual ease. Did he? He said it after that business with the Greer brothers in the spring. Thomas paused, the way children do when they are referencing things they have overheard rather than been told. The spring before he got sick. He was probably right, Annie said, and they walked the rest of the way home in the companionable quiet that they had developed together, this mother and son who were learning the language of their smaller family. 3 weeks passed. During those 3 weeks, Annie worked the ranch with the grim practical efficiency that had sustained her since Robert died. She was not a soft woman in the sense of being fragile, but she was not a hardened woman either. She was simply someone who had always understood that work was the most honest answer to almost every problem, and that sentiment, however genuine, was not a substitute for action. She tended the vegetable garden that provided a significant part of their food, maintained the remaining livestock, which was 2 horses and a small number of chickens, and spent her evenings going over the figures in Robert's ledger with the close attention of someone who was learning a language that no one had thought to teach her. She also thought about Clayton Ford more than she intended to, not in a way that alarmed her, not in any way that felt disloyal to Robert, which surprised her a little, because she had expected the guilt of it and found instead something more like bewilderment, as though her own interior landscape had rearranged itself without asking her permission. It was not that she was in love with the sheriff. She had spoken to him for perhaps 40 minutes total in her life. It was more that she kept returning to the specific quality of how he had listened to her, which was differently from how most people listened to her now that she was a widow, with that careful cushioning of attention that was really just a form of managing potential grief. Clayton Ford had listened to her, as though she was someone with a problem that required solving, rather than a situation that required managing. And she had not understood, until she walked out of his office, how much she had needed to be heard in exactly that way. She was pulling weeds from the kitchen garden on a Wednesday afternoon in late July, when she heard a horse on the road, and looked up to see a rider turning through her gate. She straightened and shielded her eyes against the afternoon sun, and recognized the rider as Deputy Hector Ruiz, a young man of about 24 who worked under Clayton Ford and who had a pleasant, open face and a tendency to tip his hat at every woman he encountered, as though making up for some general shortage of good manners elsewhere. He drew up his horse at the edge of the garden and tipped his hat. "Afternoon, Mrs. Wells. I've got a message from the sheriff." Annie pulled off her gardening gloves. "Let me hear it." "Gerald Marsh responded," Deputy Ruiz said, and she could tell from the careful neutrality of his expression that the news was not entirely straightforward. "He sent a letter. He acknowledges the debt but says he disputes the amount, claims it was $90, not $115. Annie was quiet for a moment. The irritation that moved through her was clean and specific. "The note says $115, she said. "Yes, ma'am." "Sheriff says the note is the binding document, and that Marsh's dispute doesn't carry legal weight given the specific figures in the note. He says Marsh is testing you, seeing if you'll take 90 and be done with it." Deputy Ruiz reached into his jacket and produced an envelope. "He wrote everything out here for you. He wants to know how you'd like to proceed." Annie took the envelope. She opened it and read Clayton Ford's letter, which was written in a clear, direct hand, and laid out her options with the same lack of condescension she had already experienced from him in person. He recommended responding with a firm rejection of Marsh's counter, and a renewed demand for the full amount within 14 days, with explicit notice that the matter would be placed before the county court at Fredericksburg if the full sum was not received. He noted, in a tone that was somehow dry even in written form, that men like Marsh calculated risk very precisely, and that a court action would cost Marsh more in time and reputation than the $25 difference he was attempting to save. Annie read the letter twice. Then she looked up at Deputy Ruiz. "Tell the sheriff I accept his recommendation. I would like to come in and discuss it in person if he has time tomorrow morning." Deputy Ruiz smiled. "I'll let him know, Mrs. Wells." She was at the sheriff's office at 9 the following morning, this time without Thomas, who had been left in the care of Mrs. Calder again, with instructions to be helpful and not to climb anything. The office smelled the same as before, coffee and pine wood, and Clayton Ford was standing at his gun rack when she came in, inspecting a rifle with the focused attention of someone doing a routine check. He set it down when she entered and offered her the same chair as before. This morning he had rolled his sleeves to the elbow because of the heat, which was already building by 9, and there was something more informal about him than there had been in their first meeting. Not careless, just less formal. Annie noticed it the way she noticed most things, quietly, and without making it mean more than it did. They talked through the response to Marsh for perhaps 20 minutes, and then the conversation moved, with a naturalness that Annie would later try to retrace and could not quite, into something else. Clayton asked her how long she had been in Harlan Creek, and she told him that she and Robert had come from San Marcos 7 years ago when they married, and that Robert had grown up in this part of Texas hill country and had always wanted to work land there, and that she had come to love the cedar-covered hills even when the summer heat was an assault, and the winter wind came through the gaps in the ranch house walls like it had personal grievances. Clayton told her that he had come to Harlan Creek after a period working as a deputy in Abilene, and that he had found Abilene to be a town in such a constant state of becoming that it had no time to be anything at all, and that Harlan Creek's particular brand of stubbornness appealed to him because at least it knew what it was. Annie laughed at that. It was a real laugh, not a polite one, and it startled both of them slightly. "That is exactly what Harlan Creek is," she said. "Stubborn." Robert always said the land, and the people matched each other. He was right about that, Clayton said, and his tone when he said Robert's name had nothing uncomfortable in it, no tiptoeing, which was a relief that Annie could not quite articulate but felt distinctly. "How long have you been the sheriff?" she asked. 4 years. I expect I'll be here another 4 before anyone decides to change things." He said it without particular satisfaction or complaint, just as a statement of the likely shape of things. "Do you like it, the work?" He considered the question seriously, as though it deserved consideration. "I like what it does when it works right," he said. "Protecting people who need protecting, keeping order that lets ordinary life happen. That part I like. The parts where the law is limited or slow or doesn't reach far enough, those parts are harder. Like the fact that a widow has to walk into a sheriff's office to collect money that is rightfully hers because a broker in San Antonio is betting she won't pursue it," Annie said, and she said it without bitterness, just clarity. Clayton looked at her with a steadiness that matched her own. "Exactly like that," he said. "And for what it's worth, the fact that you did walk in is going to make the difference. Most people in your situation don't." "I have a son," Annie said. Not pursuing it was never an option. The morning went on longer than either of them had planned. At some point, Clayton refilled his coffee cup and offered her some, which she accepted, and they talked about the hill country summer and the prospects for the fall grazing season, and the particular difficulty of maintaining a working ranch on reduced labor with reduced capital. And Clayton mentioned with a matter-of-fact air that he had a small plot of land east of town that had belonged to his uncle, and that he had not yet decided what to do with. And Annie found herself asking intelligent questions about the soil composition in that part of the county, because she had learned quite a bit about soil in 7 years of farming, and the knowledge was still in her even when the farm was struggling. When she finally stood to leave, it was past 11 o'clock and she had the distinct sense of having spent 2 hours in a conversation that had only felt like 45 minutes. Clayton walked her to the door, and when she stepped out onto the boardwalk, he stayed in the doorway. "I'll have the formal response to Marsh sent today," he said. "You'll hear from me when he responds." "Thank you," she said. She meant it again and again without ceremony. "Mrs. Wells." He said it just as she was turning toward the street. She turned back. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not entirely decode, something considered, something that had been decided and was being said carefully. "If it would be acceptable to you, I'd be glad to ride out and check on things at your ranch sometime, purely in a professional capacity, to make sure you're not having any trouble from Marsh or anyone else who might take advantage of the situation you're in." Annie understood perfectly well that this was not purely professional. She was 28 years old and she had been married 7 years, and she was not innocent of the ways in which people said one thing while meaning something adjacent to it. But she also understood that the offer was being made with honesty and care and without any pressure whatsoever, and that if she said no, he would accept it without difficulty, and that if she said yes, he would behave exactly as he had described. "That would be acceptable," she said. "Thank you, Sheriff." His expression did not change dramatically, but there was something in his eyes that settled, like a question that had been answered in a direction he had hoped for without expecting it. "Saturday afternoon," he said, "if that works." "Saturday afternoon," she agreed. She walked back to collect Thomas from Mrs. Calder's with the strange, tentative sensation of being a woman who has picked up something unfamiliar and is not yet sure whether it is precious or fragile or both. Saturday came with a sky the particular shade of washed blue that the Texas hill country produced when it was trying to be beautiful, the kind of sky that made the cedar-covered hills look painted and the limestone outcrops glow the color of old honey. Annie had spent the morning with Thomas in the garden and had told herself 3 times that she was not going to tidy herself up particularly for a professional visit from the sheriff, and had then tidied herself up anyway, changing from her work dress into the second of the 2 dresses she owned that were not work dresses, a slightly better calico in a deep green that had been a birthday gift from Robert 2 years ago, and which she had always thought suited her well. Clayton arrived at 2:30 on a good bay horse with a calm, intelligent eye, and he was wearing his badge and his hat and his boots and looking like exactly what he was, a Texas sheriff making a routine call. He dismounted at her gate and tied the horse to the post there with the automatic efficiency of a man who had done this 10,000 times. Thomas was on the porch when Clayton came through the gate, and he looked at the sheriff with the grave, evaluating attention of a 7-year-old who was still working out the exact shape of the world and where everyone in it fit. "You're the sheriff," Thomas said. "I am," Clayton said, stopping at the bottom of the porch steps. He was good with children, Annie could tell immediately, not in the overly bright, performative way of adults who found children inconvenient and were hiding it, but in the simple way of someone who was willing to take a child seriously. "Your name is Thomas. How do you know that?" "Your mother told me." Thomas considered this. "She came to your office," he said. "She did. She's a very capable woman, your mother." Thomas glanced at Annie with an expression that 7-year-olds use when adults say things they already know. "I know that," he said. Something moved through Clayton's face that was close to a smile but quieter. He looked up at Annie on the porch. "Afternoon, Mrs. Wells." "Afternoon, Sheriff Ford. Come in and have some water. The ride from town in this heat must be something." He came up the porch steps and they sat in the 2 chairs there that looked out over the front pasture and the cedar-draped hills beyond, and Thomas hovered for a while with the specific orbit of a child who is curious but trying to maintain dignity, and eventually went off to the side of the house where he had a project involving several rocks and a stick that Annie had decided not to investigate too closely. Clayton drank his water and looked out at the land. "Good pasture," he said. "Good slope to it, drainage will be solid. Robert always said the same." He thought it was better grazing land than most people realized. He was probably right. Good root systems in this soil type. He paused. "What are you planning to do with it, long term?" Annie had been thinking about this more clearly in the past few weeks than she had been able to in the months immediately after Robert's death, when long-term planning had felt like a kind of presumption on the future's goodwill. "I would like to keep it," she said simply. "I want Thomas to have it. It was his father's, and it should be his when he's old enough to know what to do with it. In the short term, I am thinking about whether I could take in some of the neighbor's stock for grazing on a payment arrangement, It would bring in some income without requiring me to run a full cattle operation on my own. Clayton nodded. That's a practical approach. Hector Ruiz's family has a spread about 6 miles east. They're good people. They might be interested in an arrangement like that. Do you think they'd consider it seriously? I think if I mentioned your situation to them, they'd do more than consider it. The Ruiz family has been in this county longer than almost anyone. They understand what it means to hold land and protect it. He looked at her then with a directness that was becoming familiar to her. I can introduce you if you'd like. You are doing a great deal for me, Sheriff, Annie said, and she said it with the careful awareness of someone taking an accurate measurement. You are in a situation that should not be as difficult as it has been made, Clayton said. It costs me nothing to use what connections I have on behalf of someone who deserves the help. They sat in the particular quiet of a Texas summer afternoon, the sound of cicadas rising and falling in the cedars and the distant sound of Thomas muttering to himself about whatever engineering project the rocks and the stick were serving. And the quality of the quiet between them was one of those silences that is not empty but full, the kind that happens between people who have already begun to be comfortable without having quite registered when that happened. Can I ask you something personal? Annie said, and she asked it the same way she did everything, directly. You can ask, Clayton said. Were you ever married? The question sat between them for a moment. Clayton turned his water glass in his hands. I was engaged, he said. A long time ago in Abilene. Her name was Lydia. She decided that the wife of a lawman lived too much with uncertainty, and she was not wrong. She married a merchant, and I imagine she has been much more comfortable than she would have been with me. He said it without grief and without bitterness, with the tone of a man who has made his peace with a thing and filed it away properly. Do you regret it? No, he said. Or not often. I think I was in love with the idea of her more than with the actual woman, which is a thing that happens when you're young and have not yet learned the difference. He paused. You learn the difference eventually. Annie was quiet for a moment. Robert and I were very suited, she said. We did not always agree on everything, and there were difficulties, but we were genuinely suited. I miss him in the way that you miss a part of the landscape that you had stopped noticing until it was gone. She said this with the honesty she brought to everything, without performing grief and without diminishing it. That is a meaningful thing to have had, Clayton said, and it was. It is, she agreed. I do not expect to find it again, but I have found that I am capable of more than I thought I was this year. That is something. Clayton looked at her for a long moment with an expression that she could feel the weight of without quite being able to name. You are more than you think you are, he said quietly, and then, as though catching himself being more direct than a professional visit required, he looked back out at the pasture. But Annie had heard it, and she sat with it the way you sit with something that you are not ready to examine fully but are not willing to put down. He stayed another hour. He walked the fence line with her at her invitation, and looked at the section that needed repair, and told her which of the timber yards in town would give her a fair price on fencing material without overcharging a woman on her own. He talked to Thomas for a solid 10 minutes about the rock construction project, which turned out to be an attempted model of a dam that Thomas had seen mentioned in a book from his school. And Clayton gave the project his full attention and made one practical suggestion about the water channel that Thomas received with the solemn approval of a young engineer, accepting a colleague's input. When Clayton rode away down the road in the late afternoon light, Thomas stood beside his mother on the porch and watched him go. I like him, Thomas said. Annie looked at her son. Do you? He talked about the dam like it was a real dam, Thomas said, with the specific intensity of a child for whom this distinction mattered enormously. Most grown-up men talk about it like it's a toy. Annie put her hand on her son's head. That is a good observation, she said. You like him too, Thomas said, with the casual certainty of childhood. Annie did not answer that, but she also did not deny it, which was itself an answer. It was 12 days after Clayton's visit to the ranch that Deputy Ruiz came riding out again with another envelope, and this time when Annie read the letter, the news was better. Gerald Marsh had responded to the formal demand. He was offering $110, 5 short of the full amount, and indicating that he would have the sum sent by bank draft within 10 days. Annie read the letter 3 times. $110 was not $115, and she recognized that Marsh was still attempting a small maneuver. But the gap had narrowed dramatically, and the likelihood of the money actually arriving had increased substantially. She wrote a response on the spot, sitting at the kitchen table, and she wrote that she accepted $110 in full settlement of the debt only if the bank draft arrived within 7 days, not 10. And if it did not arrive within 7 days, she would be pursuing the full $115 before the county court, with no further offers of settlement considered. She gave the response to Deputy Ruiz with the same calm she had given everything else. The bank draft for $110 arrived on the 5th day. Annie held the draft in both hands at the kitchen table and felt something that was not quite triumph, but was in the same family as it. Thomas was at school, and the house was quiet around her, and she sat for a moment just holding the fact that she had done this, that she had walked into a sheriff's office with a piece of paper and her own determination, and had walked out 4 weeks later with money in her hand that was rightfully hers. She thought about Clayton Ford. She went into town the next day. She went to the bank first and applied the $110 to the debt there, which reduced it to $120, a number that was still pressing but was different in character from the original $230. The bank's representative, the thin, reedy Mr. Finch, looked at the payment with something approaching respect and offered her a revised arrangement on the remaining balance that was marginally better than what she had been working with. She accepted it and shook his hand. Then she went to the sheriff's office. Clayton was at his desk and stood when she came in, and she could see in the immediate quality of his attention that he had been waiting to hear, that this was not a professional indifference. She told him about the bank draft and the bank meeting, and his expression did something that she had not seen it do before. He smiled. Not the contained, almost smile she had seen before, but an actual smile, full and warm and directed entirely at her, and it changed his face in a way that Annie felt somewhere in the center of her chest with a specificity that surprised her. "Well done," he said, and the warmth in it was genuine. "Well done to both of us," she said. "I could not have done it without you starting the process." "You'd have found another way," he said, with the certainty of someone who had been paying attention. She put her hand on his desk and slid a folded piece of paper across it. He picked it up and opened it. It was a certificate of appreciation, handwritten by Annie in her clear, careful script, thanking the office of the sheriff of Harlan Creek for its assistance in resolving a legal matter. It was formal and proper and said exactly nothing personal, but it was also on paper that smelled faintly of the lavender she kept in a sachet in her correspondence drawer, and when he held it, he was very close to the scent of it. He looked up from the paper. Something passed between them that was not quite words. "I wonder," Clayton said carefully, with the manner of a man testing ice, "if you would accept a dinner invitation from me at the Harlan Creek Hotel dining room, which is not what anyone would call elegant but does a reasonable beef stew. As a personal matter, separate entirely from any professional business." Annie looked at him. She looked at him for long enough that he had time to wonder if he had miscalculated, but she was not hesitating because she was unsure. She was looking at him because she was giving herself time to be certain, to let the clarity of her own feeling settle before she spoke. "I would accept that," she said. The color in his expression shifted slightly, warm. "Saturday evening," he said. "I will come to the ranch and escort you in if that's agreeable." "That's agreeable," she said. "I will need to arrange care for Thomas." "Of course," he said. "Mrs. Calder, she won't mind," Annie said. "She'll probably think it's overdue." This time she was almost certain she heard him laugh under his breath as she walked out the door. The Harlan Creek Hotel dining room was, as Clayton had warned, not elegant. It had 4 tables covered with white cloths that were very nearly white, oil lamps that produced a warm amber light that softened the rough-hewn walls, and a menu that changed with whatever the kitchen had available, which tonight was beef stew with corn bread, fried salt pork with beans, and apple pie that the hotel proprietress Mrs. Swanson made herself and which was, Annie had to admit, genuinely excellent. They sat across from each other at the corner table, which was slightly more private than the others, and the evening opened up before them with the particular quality that evenings have when two people have been wanting to be in this specific situation and have finally arranged themselves into it. They talked for 3 hours. Annie could not afterward have given a complete accounting of everything they talked about, because it was the kind of conversation that flows naturally from one thing to the next without clearly marked borders. But she remembered the texture of it, how easy it was, how there was none of the performance that she had associated with the idea of courtship from her distant memories of being a younger woman. She had been married at 21 and had not been in this situation since then, and she had half expected it to feel strange. But instead it felt like a conversation she had been wanting to have for some time without knowing it. Clayton talked about his family, a father who had been a farmer in Hill County before he died, a mother who still lived in Lampasas, and who wrote him letters full of local gossip and maternal concern about his eating habits, a sister named Clara who had married a schoolteacher and moved to Austin. He talked about why he had become a lawman, which was something that had happened in increments rather than as a single decision, starting with a summer when he was 19, and had helped a neighboring family recover stolen horses with a level-headed persistence that the local deputy had noticed and commented on. He talked about the particular satisfaction and particular frustration of trying to maintain justice in a part of the country where the law was still building its own foundations. Annie talked about growing up in San Marcos, about her mother who had been a schoolteacher and her father who had worked the local mill, about the small house where she had grown up and the big oak tree in the yard that she had fallen out of twice and climbed 100 times, about studying hard and reading everything she could find because books were how she had mapped a world larger than the one she was growing up in. She talked about meeting Robert at 20 at a church social, and knowing quite quickly that he was someone she could build a life with, not a grand romantic lightning bolt of recognition, but something steadier and better suited to the actual work of living. "Were you happy?" Clayton asked. "Yes," she said. "Not every day, because happiness is not a constant state for anyone with real responsibilities. But substantially yes, and with a real man, not an imagined one, which I think is worth more." "That's a mature way of thinking about it," he said. "Robert was a mature thing to have," she said. "He earned it." They were quiet for a moment, and in the lamplight Clayton's face was softer than it was in the daylight of the office, and Annie thought that this was perhaps what he looked like when he was simply himself rather than the shape that his job required him to hold. "What do you want?" he asked. "For yourself, going forward, past the bank debt and the fencing and the practical necessities." The question surprised her slightly because it was the kind of question that people did not usually ask, or asked in a way that made clear they were hoping for a particular kind of simple answer. He asked it as though he actually wanted to know. "I want to keep the land," she said. "I want Thomas to grow up there and know it as home. I want to be useful, to use whatever I know and can learn to do something that matters." She paused. "I want not to be alone in the way that I have been this year. Not because I cannot manage it, because I can, but because I don't particularly want to if there were another option." She had said it plainly because plainness was her way, and she watched him take it in. "Those seem like reasonable wants," he said quietly. "What do you want?" she returned. He was quiet for a moment in a way that felt like genuine thought rather than evasion. "The same as what I have mostly," he said. "Work that means something. A place that is home in more than just the practical sense." He looked at her across the lamplight. "Someone to come home to." The words sat between them simply. No one performed anything. Annie met his eyes across the table and felt the thing in her chest that she had been careful about expand slightly, cautiously, like a plant that has been kept in a dry place for a long time and is being given water for the first time and is not yet certain whether it trusts the rain. The evening ended with Clayton driving her back to the ranch in a borrowed buggy. Thomas successfully delivered back from Mrs. Calder's and presumably asleep in the ranch house. The Texas sky above them enormous and absolutely blazing with stars the way it gets in July in the hill country when the air is clear, and the moon has not yet risen, and there is nothing between you and the full depth of the sky but the warm, dark air. They drove in comfortable quiet most of the way. When Clayton pulled the buggy up at her gate, he helped her down with a hand that held hers a moment longer than strictly necessary and let go without making a scene of it. "I'd like to see you again," he said, standing at the gate, his hat in his hand. "I know," Annie said. "I would like that too." He put his hat back on. "There's a dance at the church social in 2 weeks," he said. "Would you come with me?" Annie thought about the last dance she had attended, which had been with Robert 2 years before he died, and she let herself sit with the memory for exactly 1 moment without letting it become a prohibition. "Yes," she said, "I'll come with you." He smiled in the dark, and she could feel it more than see it. "Good night, Annie," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name. She was already through the gate when she turned back. "Good night, Clayton," she said. She went into the house and stood in the dark kitchen for a long moment, listening to the sound of the buggy moving away down the road, and she was smiling in the way that people smile when they are alone, and there is no one to perform it for, and so it is entirely real. In the weeks that followed, things moved the way things move in small Texas towns in 1882, which was simultaneously slowly and with a great deal of community awareness. Harlan Creek was not a place where 2 people could take dinner together at the hotel and drive back to a ranch in a buggy under a star-filled sky, without it being noted by the people who made it their business to note such things. And since this was a town where Annie Wells was known and respected and sympathized with in her loss, and where Clayton Ford was the sheriff, and therefore a figure of both official authority and general scrutiny, the fact of their developing courtship was a matter of communal interest within about 48 hours. Annie was aware of this and was not particularly bothered by it. She had lived in small communities long enough to understand that this interest was mostly benign, that it came from people who genuinely wished her well, and who found in her situation a story that was satisfying in outline. A widow who had faced difficulty with courage and who was finding something new. She accepted the gentle curiosity of Mrs. Calder and the pointed pleasantness of Mrs. Patton at the general store, and the fact that Deputy Ruiz was suddenly finding rather more reasons to ride past her ranch on his patrol routes with a cheerfulness that was far too elaborate to be coincidental. What she was less prepared for was Thomas. Thomas was 7 years old and perceptive in the way that children who have learned to pay close attention are perceptive. He had observed Clayton's visit to the ranch, and the change in his mother's expression over the weeks that followed, and the fact that she had gone to dinner and come home looking different than she went, not sad, not guilty, but different in a way that he was processing with the seriousness he brought to everything. One evening in late August, 3 weeks after the dinner, Thomas came in from outside and sat at the kitchen table while Annie was mending a shirt, and he was quiet for long enough that she looked up. "What is it, Thomas? Are you going to marry the sheriff?" Thomas asked. Annie put down the mending. She looked at her son with the full, undivided attention she always gave him. "What makes you ask that? You look like you might be thinking about it," Thomas said. "We have had one dinner," Annie said carefully. "We are friends who are spending some time together. Marriage is a very large thing that happens after a great deal more than that." Thomas absorbed this. "But it could happen," he said. "Many things could happen, Thomas. Why are you asking?" He was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was gathering himself toward something honest. "Because I want to know if it's okay," he said. "If you did." Annie felt something move through her that was not quite pain and not quite love, but was made of both. She moved from her chair to sit beside her son and looked at him directly. "Do you think it would be okay?" she asked. For you, that is what I need to know first. Thomas looked at his hands. I miss Papa, he said. I know I do too. But it's not like he's coming back, Thomas said with the brutal, plain honesty of a child saying a true thing that adults talk around. And you're sad by yourself, not all the time, but sometimes. Yes, Annie said simply. Sometimes. He's not bad, Thomas said, meaning Clayton, with the evaluative certainty of a child who has made a considered assessment. He talked about the dam like it was real. Annie put her arm around her son. That is a sound basis for a character judgment, she said seriously. Thomas leaned into her. You should probably find out if he would be okay with me being here, he said. Because if he wasn't, then it wouldn't work. That is an extremely wise thing to say, Annie said. I know, Thomas said, with the comfort of a child who has resolved something in his own mind and is ready to move on to other concerns. Annie held her son for a few minutes longer and then let him go back outside to whatever project currently required his attention, and she sat in the kitchen with the mending in her lap and thought about what Thomas had said with the steadiness and the honesty that she brought to everything important. The church social and the dance came on a Saturday evening in the third week of August. The whole town seemed to have turned out, which was normal for a Harlan Creek church social, and the evening air was a degree or two cooler than the weeks before had been, which everyone was treating as a personal gift from the sky. The church hall had been cleared of its usual furniture, and the windows opened to the night, and someone's fiddle player uncle had arrived from Careville and set up in the corner with two companions, one with a guitar and one with a harmonica, and they were producing music that made the feet want to move before the mind had quite agreed to. Clayton arrived at Annie's ranch in the buggy at 6:30, and Mrs. Calder had arrived at 5:30 to take Thomas for the evening, and had squeezed Annie's hand with the satisfaction of a woman watching something go right. Annie had done her hair differently, loosening it slightly from its usual strict practicality, and she was wearing the green calico dress again, because she only had the two good ones and the green was better. And when Clayton handed her into the buggy and said, "You look very fine this evening, Annie," she believed him without qualification. The dance was everything that such events were in hill country Texas towns in 1882. Loud and warm and communal and slightly sweaty and genuinely joyful in the uncomplicated way that people who work hard are joyful when they stop working. Annie danced 2 dances with Clayton, who moved with more grace than she had expected from such a large man, and 1 dance with old Mr. Calder, who insisted on dancing with everyone's wife or nearest equivalent regardless of age or invitation. And she stood with Clayton at the side of the room between sets and drank the lemonade that Mrs. Swanson made available for these occasions and watched the town of Harlan Creek do its collective best to be merry. It was during a quieter moment between sets, when the fiddle player was consulting with his companions about the next selection, that Gerald Marsh walked in. Annie saw him before Clayton did. She recognized him from a description she had pieced together from various sources. A stocky man of about 50 with a well-maintained suit and a confidence that sat on him like a coat he was very proud of. He had clearly not expected to encounter either of them here, and when his eyes found Annie, there was a flash of something that moved across his face too quickly for her to entirely name. Clayton had followed her gaze. His expression had not changed, but his posture had adjusted in a way that was almost imperceptible and very clear to Annie, who was close enough to feel it. "Marsh," he said quietly. "Yes," Annie said equally quietly. Gerald Marsh approached them because there was nothing else he could reasonably do without making a scene that would be more damaging to himself than to anyone else. He was a man who operated in a world of calculations, and he was calculating rapidly. "Mrs. Wells," he said, with a tone that was a tempting warmth and achieving only its outline, "I trust you received my draft." "I received it," Annie said. "Thank you for sending it." "A matter of basic business," Marsh said, with the air of a man who has decided that the most face-saving interpretation of events is the one where he had always intended to pay. No ill intent. Annie looked at him with the gray-green steadiness that made people uncomfortable. No ill intent, she agreed, without indicating that she believed this. Marsh glanced at Clayton, who was standing with his hands relaxed at his sides and his expression pleasantly neutral, which was the expression Clayton used when he was thinking several things simultaneously and none of them were particularly pleasant. "Sheriff," Marsh said. "Marsh," Clayton said. "Enjoy the social." Marsh found himself in a town where the sheriff and the widow he had attempted to shortchange were standing together at a church dance, and the calculation he was running was producing a result that strongly suggested moving away and doing so quickly. He did. Annie watched him go and felt something she might describe as satisfaction, clean and complete. "Well," Clayton said. "Indeed," Annie said. He handed her his lemonade glass and went to exchange a few quiet words with Deputy Ruiz, who had also seen Marsh and was keeping a mild professional eye on him. When Clayton came back, the fiddle had started again, and he offered her his hand. "I believe this is a waltz," he said. "I believe it is," she agreed, and she took his hand. They danced, and it was not an elegant performance because the hall was crowded and the floor was not entirely level, and the fiddle player's interpretation of waltz time was somewhat creative. But none of that mattered. What mattered was that Clayton's hand was at her waist, and her hand was in his, and they were moving together through the warm, crowded room with the specific ease of two people who have discovered that they fit, not perfectly, because nothing is perfect, but genuinely and with a naturalness that is better than perfection because it is real. "Thomas asked me a question last week," Annie said, as they turned through the room. "What did he ask?" "He asked if it would be okay, if things went further between us." Clayton was quiet for a moment and she felt his hand at her waist steady, grounded. "What did you tell him?" "I told him that marriage was a very large thing that happened after much more than a few weeks," Annie said. "And then I asked him what he thought." "And what did he think?" "He said he wanted to know if you would be okay with him being there," Annie said, and she said it watching Clayton's face carefully. Something crossed Clayton Ford's expression that was deep and honest and entirely unperformed. He looked down at her with those dark brown eyes that were tonight entirely warm, without any of their professional opacity. "He needs to know that?" he asked. "He does." "Then I need to talk to Thomas," Clayton said simply, as though this were an obvious next step that he had already been considering. Annie felt the thing in her chest that had been cautiously tentative do something that she could only describe as deciding. Not all at once, not with drama, just a quiet interior settling, like a key turning in a lock that has always been the right one. "I think that would be good," she said. September arrived and brought with it the first cooling of the air that the hill country called fall, even though the real cool was still a month away. And the change in temperature had the effect it always had of making everything feel slightly more possible. The cedar trees were the same dark green they were always, but the light through them in the morning was different, amber and slanted, and the hills east of the ranch took on a warmth that was different from summer's assault. Clayton came to the ranch on a Sunday afternoon 2 weeks after the dance. He had asked Annie if he could come specifically to speak with Thomas, and she had appreciated the asking enough that she had told him to come, and had then stayed deliberately out of earshot when they sat together on the porch steps, the large man and the small boy, while she worked in the kitchen garden close enough to intervene if needed and far enough to let the conversation be its own. She could not hear what they said. She could see them from across the yard, the serious posture of her son and the careful, attentive posture of the man beside him, and she could see that it was a real conversation, one that lasted 15 minutes, and involved Thomas asking something pointed midway through, because Clayton sat forward and clasped his hands between his knees in the way he did when he was choosing his words with care, and Thomas listening with the full solemn attention he gave things that mattered. When it was done, Thomas came across the yard to the garden and said, "He said he wouldn't try to be my father because my father was real and I would know the difference. He said he would try to be someone else, something good but different." Annie sat back on her heels among the bean plants and looked at her son. He said I could think about it for as long as I needed and he wouldn't make it something I had to decide, Thomas said. He said it was my home and my family and he was the one coming into it, not the other way around. Annie was very quiet for a moment. What did you say? I said okay, Thomas said, with the simplicity of a child who has received the right answer and is ready to accept it. I said he could come around. Annie pressed her hand briefly to her son's cheek. Good, she said. That was a very mature thing to say. Thomas gave her his small shrug that meant he knew and went off to find something else to do, and Annie stayed in the garden for a moment longer with her hands in the soil and her eyes briefly closed. Then she stood up and went to where Clayton was still sitting on the porch steps, and she sat down beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. Thank you, she said. I meant it, he said. All of it. I know, she said. That is why I'm thanking you. They sat in the Sunday afternoon quiet. The cedar hills spread before them, the distant sound of Thomas presumably doing something constructive. And after a while Clayton's hand moved and covered hers where it rested on the step between them, and she turned her hand over and held his hand back, and they stayed like that for a long time in the warm September light. The courtship that followed was conducted with the particular character of two people who were both past their first youth, and who had both learned that life was not endlessly patient. They were deliberate without being slow. Clayton came to the ranch on Sundays, and sometimes on a midweek evening when the town was quiet. Annie came into town for practical business, and stopped at the sheriff's office with regularity that was noted by everyone in Harlan Creek, with the quiet approval that small communities bestow when something that seems right is happening. They rode together on the hill country trails in the early October mornings, when the air was finally cool enough to make riding a pleasure rather than an endurance, and talked without the formality of official visits or the self-consciousness of the early evenings. Out on the land, with the cedar-covered hills around them and the wide sky overhead, they talked about things that mattered. Annie told him about the loneliness of the year since Robert died, the particular quality of a loneliness that is not about being alone so much as about having no one to tell the small things to, the daily accumulations of observation, and thought that needs somewhere to land. Clayton listened to this with the focus he gave everything, and then told her about his own version of the same thing, which had a different texture since he was surrounded by people all day, but which had the same essential core, the absence of someone who knew you specifically. They talked about the land, about what Annie wanted to do with the grazing lease arrangement she was developing with the Ruiz family, which was proceeding well enough that the bank debt was now manageable and likely to be resolved within 6 months. They talked about what Clayton's position in Harlan Creek meant in practical terms, the fact that he would likely be here for the foreseeable future, that his life was rooted in this specific place. Annie found that she was glad of this, because her own roots were here, in the 40 acres and the Cedar Hills, and the school where Thomas was learning his letters and numbers, and the thought of moving anywhere felt like betrayal. One morning in late October they stopped on the ridge above the ranch where you could see the whole of the valley below, her land spread out in the morning light with the ranch house small and purposeful at its center, and Clayton had looked at it for a long time without speaking. "It's a good piece of land," he said finally. "It is," Annie said. "Good place to raise a family," he said, and he said it looking at the land rather than at her, with the careful sideways approach of a man who is saying something large and is giving the other person the option of receiving it at whatever angle is most comfortable. Annie looked at him. "Are you asking me something, Clayton Ford?" He turned to look at her then. The morning light was on his face and his expression was the most open she had ever seen it. No professional composure, no managed neutrality, just the face of a man who is at the edge of something important and has decided to go over it. "I am asking you to marry me," he said, plainly, "because I think you prefer plain things." Annie felt the warmth move through her from the center outward, steady and sure. She thought about the morning she had walked into the sheriff's office with a promissory note and a determination to fight for what was owed her, and how she had walked out thinking about little more than the next practical step. She thought about what she had not expected to find there. "I do prefer plain things," she said, "and plainly, yes, I will marry you." He moved his horse closer to hers on the ridge and reached out and took her face in both his hands and kissed her, gently and with great certainty, with the morning sun of the hill country on their backs and the valley below them full of light. They were married in the Harlan Creek church on the second Saturday of November, 1882, in the way that such things were done in small Texas towns, with the community present because the community was always present, and because Annie and Clayton were both people who had put down roots in Harlan Creek deep enough that their marrying was a communal event whether they intended it to be or not. The church was full. Mrs. Calder cried into her handkerchief with the unashamed emotion of a woman who has been watching this develop and is entitled to her feelings about it. Deputy Ruiz stood at the back with the largest smile in the room. Mrs. Swanson brought a cake. Annie wore a dress she had sewn herself from fabric that was the closest to white that the general store had available, which was an ivory muslin that suited her better than pure white would have anyway. She wore her hair down, which she almost never did, and it fell to her shoulders in dark waves that Clayton had confessed, on a recent evening on the porch, to having thought about more than was strictly appropriate for a lawman who was supposed to be thinking about order and justice. Thomas stood beside Clayton during the ceremony and held himself with the seriousness of a boy who understood that he was witnessing something large and was determined to honor it by standing still, which was a significant personal sacrifice for a 7-year-old. The minister read from Ruth, because Annie had requested it, the passage about "Where you go, I will go," which she had always thought was not a love story about a romantic relationship so much as about the kind of love that commits to a place and a person with full knowledge of the cost, and she thought that was the most honest kind. When the minister said that Clayton could kiss his bride, he did, and the room made the noise that rooms make when they have been waiting for exactly this. Afterward, there was a celebration in the church hall with Mrs. Swanson's cake and the fiddle player's uncle again, and dancing that went on until 11, which was late by Harlan Creek standards, and was taken as evidence of how pleased the town was about the whole affair. Thomas stayed awake until 9:30 before he fell asleep in a chair in the corner of the hall with the absolute totality of a child who has run out of energy mid-commitment, and Clayton carried him out to the buggy and drove the small new family back to what was now their home, the ranch house with its patched roof, and its kitchen garden, and its 40 acres of good grazing land spread out under the November sky. They put Thomas to bed and stood for a moment in the hallway of the house, this man and this woman who had been two separate solitudes and were now something else, and the house was quiet around them, and the Texas sky outside was enormous and cold and lit with stars. "Hello, Mrs. Ford," Clayton said. Annie looked up at him with the gray-green eyes that made people look twice without knowing why, and she smiled in the way that she smiled when there was nothing to perform, when it was entirely real. "Hello, Sheriff Ford," she said. He laughed then, a full and genuine sound that filled the hallway of the ranch house and settled into the walls of it like the beginning of something permanent. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was a good one, as winters went in the Texas hill country. Cold but not brutal, the cedars dark and still against the pale sky, occasional light snow that Thomas greeted with the rapturous intensity of a child experiencing a rare event. Frost on the windows in the mornings that caught the early light and turned the inside of the house briefly magical. Clayton moved into the ranch house as a matter of practical arrangement, keeping his living quarters at the sheriff's office for the nights when town business required him to stay close, but making the ranch his home in the real sense of the word. He brought very little with him beyond his personal effects and his books, of which he had more than Annie had expected, a small collection that suggested a private life, considerably more interior than his professional presentation implied. He had 3 volumes of law and 2 on the geography of the American West, and a collection of poetry that he did not mention for 2 weeks, and that Annie found on the shelf and asked about with the particular interest of someone who has always loved books and recognizes another reader. "I didn't know you read poetry," she said. "I don't make it generally known," he said, with the faint defensive air of a Texas lawman who has a complicated relationship with the fact that he finds verse consoling. "Whitman," Annie said, reading the spine. "Good choice." Clayton looked at her with an expression that was trying to be neutral. "Do you read him?" "I do," she said. "And Tennyson, though I think Whitman is more honest about what things actually are." He looked at her for a long moment with something in his expression that could only be described as being pleased in a way he had not anticipated being. "Yes," he agreed. "He is." The conversation about poetry that followed lasted 2 hours and covered ground that neither of them had been able to discuss with anyone else in Harlan Creek. Not because the town was without good people, but because this particular conversation required a specific overlap of interest and willingness that is not always available between any 2 people, and finding it in the specific person you have married is a particular form of grace. Spring of 1883 arrived with the wildflowers that the hill country was famous for, bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush covering the slopes around the ranch in color that looked impossible until you saw it every year and realized it was simply the honest nature of the place. Annie was standing at the kitchen garden one morning in April with her hands in the earth and the specific knowledge of something new when she understood, with the body's wordless certainty, that she was expecting. She told Clayton that evening on the porch. He was quiet for a moment after she said it, and then he reached over and took her hand and held it very carefully, as though she had given him something fragile which she had. "Are you well?" he asked. "I'm fine," she said. "I'm perfectly fine." "Good," he said, and the word had an entire private world in it. Thomas, when told, was quiet for a long moment, and then asked whether it would be a boy or a girl. And when told that no one knew yet, he expressed a considered preference for a brother on the grounds that he was not sure what to do with a sister, a position that he announced with a pragmatism that made both his parents laugh. The summer of 1883 passed in the full life of the ranch and the town. The bank debt was fully paid off by July, a milestone that Annie marked in the ranch ledger with a simple line, and felt the clean completion of, the closing of a chapter that had opened in grief and fear, and was now closed by work and time, and the particular stubbornness that she shared with the land she lived on. The grazing arrangement with the Ruiz family was producing a small but steady income. Clayton's work continued with the steady demands of keeping order in a growing hill country town, and there were difficulties in it, as there always were, the kind of small conflicts and occasional serious disputes that come when people are living close together in hard conditions. But they managed. In the evenings, when the work was done, and Thomas was settled with his school books or his engineering projects, which had expanded considerably from the original dam, into an ongoing series of ambitious constructions in the yard that Clayton engaged with as a genuine partner. They sat on the porch in the summer dark and talked about everything and nothing, the comfortable conversation of people who have become fully known to each other. One evening in September, sitting on the porch with the last warmth of summer in the air, Clayton said, "I have been thinking about the land east of town." "Your uncle's plot," Annie said. "I've been thinking about what you said about the soil composition in that part of the county. I've been consulting with the Agricultural Extension Office in Fredericksburg, and it seems like that land might be well suited to orchards. Apple, possibly peach." Annie turned to look at him. "How much acreage?" 60 acres. About 30 would be suitable for cultivation. "That is a significant undertaking." "It is," he agreed. "But you know soil and crops better than most people in this county. And I am thinking about the future, Thomas's future, any other futures we might be building." She looked at him in the evening light with the particular quality of attention that she gave the things that mattered most. "You are planning for a long time," she said. "I tend to plan for a long time," he said. "It's a habit." She laughed, that full, genuine laugh that he had fallen in love with on a summer morning in his office. "Let's go look at the land next weekend," she said. "Yes," he said, and his hand found hers in the dark. The baby was born in late November of 1883, on a cold, clear night when the stars were so bright they seemed to press against the window panes of the ranch house. The doctor had come from town, and Mrs. Calder was there, and Clayton was there, and the whole business was conducted with the particular mixture of practical urgency and overwhelming feeling that attended births in that time and place. It was a boy, 7 pounds and 2 ounces, with Clayton's dark hair and Annie's gray-green eyes, which was a combination that made everyone in the room feel that the universe was making a good argument for itself. Thomas was brought in to see his brother the next morning and stood at the edge of the bed looking at the small, red-faced creature with the serious evaluation he brought to everything new. After a long moment he said, "He's smaller than I expected." "He'll grow," Annie said. "What's his name?" Annie and Clayton looked at each other across the bed. They had discussed this several times in the way that expectant parents discuss names with a mixture of sentiment and practicality. "Robert James Ford," Annie said. "Robert for his grandfather and James for Clayton's father." Thomas looked at the baby with a new expression, something softer and more private. "Robert," he said, trying it out. Then to the baby with the solemn authority of an older brother, "I'm Thomas. I'll show you how everything works." Clayton was sitting on the edge of the bed with his hand on Annie's hand, and he was looking at his new son with an expression that had nothing managed or measured in it, just the open, unguarded face of a man who is being remade by something he loves. Annie looked at her husband and her 2 sons, at the ranch house that had held grief and was now holding this, at the November light coming through the window and the cedar hills beyond, and she felt something settle in her completely, the closing of a long, uncertain chapter, and the opening of something new and solid and true. The winter that Robert James Ford spent as an infant in the ranch house was a rich one. Thomas proved himself as attentive and serious a big brother as he was anything else, developing a proprietary concern for the baby that extended to informing visitors of the proper procedures for holding him, and making clear that the dam project in the yard would eventually be explained to Robert, as soon as Robert was old enough to understand engineering. Clayton moved between the ranch house and the town with the steady reliability that Annie had come to recognize as fundamental to his character. Home when he could be and present when he was there in the full sense, not half-occupied by other concerns, but genuinely, entirely there. In the early spring of 1884, they began work on the orchards on Clayton's uncle's plot east of town. It was a project of years, not seasons, because fruit trees were slow investments that required planting and tending through 3 or 4 years before they produced anything worth harvesting. But Annie had grown up watching her father work the long projects, the ones that required you to put work into the earth and trust the earth to return it in its own time, and she understood this rhythm. They cleared the land on Sundays with help from the Ruiz family, and from a few other neighbors who understood that this kind of project ran on community labor and would return the favor when it was needed. The trees went in over 2 seasons, a mix of apple and peach varieties that the agricultural office in Fredericksburg had recommended for the soil type and climate, small bare-root whips planted in rows across the hillside, with the faith of farmers everywhere that things put in the ground with care would eventually grow. Thomas, who was 9 by the spring of 1884, and had developed his engineering ambitions into a genuine and wide-ranging interest in how things were built and how they worked, took a strong interest in the orchard layout, and asked enough intelligent questions about root systems and drainage and spacing that Clayton began bringing home agricultural texts from the county library for him. and Mrs. Patton at the general store commented to Mrs. Calder that the Wells Ford boy was going to be either a farmer or a scientist or possibly both. Harlan Creek itself was changing, as small Texas towns were changing in the 1880s. The railroad had come to a point 40 miles south, which changed the pace of goods and information moving through the region. New families arrived regularly, drawn by the land and the growing stability of the established settlements. Clayton's role as sheriff was increasingly one of maintaining a community infrastructure rather than managing frontier conditions. And while there were still the disputes and the occasional serious trouble that came with any human settlement, the character of the work had shifted. He was re-elected to a second term in the winter of 1883 without opposition, which pleased him less than it might have because he was fundamentally a man who found no satisfaction in the absence of challenge, but found a great deal of satisfaction in the evidence that the community trusted him. The letters from his mother in Lampasas became somewhat warmer after the wedding and the birth of Robert, as though she had been waiting for evidence that he was anchored somewhere and was now satisfied. Annie's sister-in-law from Robert's family, a woman named Della who lived in New Braunfels and with whom Annie had maintained a careful correspondence, came to visit in the spring of 1884 with her husband and their 3 children. The visit was something Annie had approached with some mixture of hope and uncertainty, because Della had loved Robert, and the question of how she would receive Clayton was one that Annie could not predict. Della was a woman of strong opinions and a sharp face that did not naturally fall into neutrality. But Della watched Clayton with Thomas for perhaps 20 minutes on the first afternoon, and watched the way Thomas talked to him with the ease of someone who has found a reliable companion, not a replacement for anything but something that stood on its own. And then Della found Annie in the kitchen and said, without preamble, Robert would have liked him. Annie looked at her former sister-in-law. "Do you think so?" "Robert liked honest men," Della said. "Men who didn't make a performance of themselves." "That's what that one is." She said it with the authority of someone delivering a verdict that had required consideration and was now final. Annie smiled. "Yes," she said, "that is what he is." The spring moved into summer, and the summer into fall, and the fall toward another winter, and the rhythm of the ranch and the town and the family moved with it. Robert James Ford grew from an infant to a baby, to a crawling, curious creature who regarded the household from ground level with enormous eyes and the specific attention of a child who is gathering information for future use. Thomas taught him things constantly and incorrectly and with great confidence, and the information had to be periodically corrected by one or both parents. But the teaching itself was its own thing, a bond between brothers that was building itself in the ordinary way of brothers, through time and proximity, and the shared experience of growing up in the same house under the same sky. Clayton and Annie found their evenings, the quiet porch hours after Thomas was settled and before Robert's night feeding, to be the best hours of their days. They talked or read or sat in comfortable silence with the hill country dark around them, and occasionally they talked about the beginning of it, about the morning Annie had walked into the sheriff's office with a promissory note in her pocket. "What did you think of me?" Annie asked one October evening. "When I first walked in." Clayton was quiet for a thoughtful moment. "I thought you were a woman who had decided that something was wrong and had come to make it right," he said. "That was the first thing. The second thing was that you had made a copy of the promissory note before you came, which told me you were the kind of person who thinks ahead without being reminded. And the third thing," she said, because there was something in his expression that indicated there was a third thing. He looked at her in the October evening light with those dark brown eyes that she now knew entirely, every shade and quality of them. "The third thing," he said, "was that you had eyes that a man could spend a considerable amount of time looking into and not find the end of." Annie felt the warmth of it move through her. "You didn't show any of that in the office," she said. "No," he said. "That would not have been professional." She laughed, and he smiled, and the evening wrapped around them with the easy comfort of two people who have built something real together and know it. In the spring of 1885, Annie discovered she was expecting again, this time in the early months, with the knowledge coming quietly and the same wordless bodily certainty as before. She told Clayton on a March evening with the early wildflowers beginning in the fields below the porch, and he held her for a long time without speaking, his chin against her hair, and when he finally spoke, he said, "Robert James is going to have a very opinionated opinion about this." He was right. Robert James, who was now 18 months old and had a vocabulary of approximately 30 words, most of them deployed with great authority and questionable accuracy, expressed his view of everything with enthusiasm, and the news of a sibling, delivered in terms he could understand, produced a response that primarily involved attempting to hand the new situation several of his own toys as a greeting. Thomas, who was 10 now and regarded himself as the senior architectural authority in the family, immediately began planning a division of the bedroom that would accommodate the addition while preserving what he called structural integrity, which was a phrase he had learned from one of the agricultural texts and had decided applied to everything worth doing. The summer of 1885 was hot, as Texas summers were, but manageable in the way that things become manageable when you are inside a life that is working. The orchard on the east plot had been growing for 2 years, and the first small fruits were beginning to appear on the apple trees, modest and green and entirely promising. Annie walked the rows on Sunday mornings sometimes with Robert James on her hip, and talked to the trees in the way that farmers have always talked to what they grow, part superstition and part genuine attention, because plants grown with attention do seem to do better, and no one in 1885 Texas was going to argue with results. The baby was born in December of 1885, on a cold night with the smell of cedar smoke from the stove and the sound of the hill country wind outside. This time it was a girl, pink and emphatic about her entrance into the world, with Annie's dark hair and, everyone agreed, Robert James's level of general intensity turned up several degrees. They named her Clara Ruth Ford, Clara for Clayton's sister in Austin and Ruth, for the verse from Scripture that had been read at their wedding, the commitment to a place, and a person with full knowledge of the cost. Clara Ruth Ford regarded the world from her first days with the specific combination of determination and curiosity that suggested she had arrived with considerable plans and intended to see them through. Thomas, who was 11, received his sister with the solemnity of someone, accepting a significant responsibility. He had recalibrated his earlier uncertainty about girls on the grounds that a sister was a specific rather than a general case and should be evaluated accordingly. Robert James, who was 2, attempted to share a biscuit with her on her 3rd day of life and had to be redirected. Clayton held his daughter in the quiet of the evening after everyone else had settled and the house was still, and Annie watched from the bed where she was resting and saw on her husband's face the same unguarded openness that had been there when Robert James was born, the look of a man who has been remade by love and is at peace with the remaking. "Hello, Clara," he said softly to the baby in his arms. "There is a great deal I intend to show you about this country." Clara blinked at him with the unfocused solemnity of a newborn, and Annie thought that this was perhaps the best thing she had ever seen. The years that followed were the full years, the ones that are not marked by dramatic events so much as by the accumulation of ordinary life lived well. Thomas grew into a young man of 16, and then 18 with the steady inevitability of children who have been loved and challenged in equal measure, developing the engineering interest that had begun with rocks and a stick into a genuine direction, corresponding with the State Agricultural College in College Station about their courses of study, and eventually, with Clayton's strong encouragement and Annie's careful financial planning from the orchard income, which by 1888 was producing real revenue. Preparing to attend. Before he left, he sat with both his parents on the porch on an August evening and was quiet for a while in the way he had been quiet since childhood, gathering himself towards something important. "I want to say something," he said. "Go ahead," Annie said. Thomas looked at Clayton. He had the height now to look him nearly level. "I told you once that I'd give you time to decide if you were okay with being here," he said. "You gave me time too. I want you to know I know what that was. What you did." Clayton looked at his stepson with an expression that held everything he felt and said nothing excessive. "You made it easy," he said. "You always did." Thomas nodded. It was the nod of a young man who has said a thing and means it and does not need to elaborate. "Okay," he said. "Good." He left for College Station in September of 1888, and Annie stood at the gate watching the wagon take him down the road with the specific, proud ache of a mother watching her child move toward the future she raised him to reach. And Clayton stood beside her with his hand on her back, steady and present as he had always been. Robert James was 5 years old in 1888, and conducting himself as 5-year-old boys conduct themselves in all times and places, which was to say, with a level of energy and creative destruction that kept both his parents and his sister fully occupied. He had Clayton's dark coloring and Annie's gray-green eyes, and his own particular combination of their personalities, which expressed itself as a cheerful stubbornness that was simultaneously exhausting and admirable. He had decided by 5 that he intended to be a rancher, a decision he announced to everyone including strangers with the confidence of someone who has thought the matter through and sees no reason to revisit it. Clara Ruth, who would be 3 in December, was the kind of child who watched everything with intense attention and then produced conclusions at unexpected moments that stopped the adults around her briefly silent. She had decided that the orchard was hers in a proprietary sense that went beyond simple fondness, and she could name every variety of tree in it at 2.5 years old, a fact that Clayton reported to his mother in Lampasas, with a pride so complete that his mother wrote back saying she had read the letter 3 times. Annie in the late 1880s was a woman who had found herself in the fullest sense. Not because she had been lost, because she had never been lost, but because the self she had been building all along had arrived at the shape that fit her best. The ranch, the orchards, the children, the work, the evenings with Clayton and the mornings that began early and ended late and were full in between. She was 34 in 1888, and she was happier than she had been at 24, and she thought this was probably how it was supposed to work, that the accumulation of known things made the happiness more solid rather than less. Clayton at 40 was the sheriff he had always been working toward being, the one who had built enough trust and enough understanding of the specific community he served that his presence in it was not just functional but genuinely good. He was a man who had learned in hard places and arrived at something settled, and the settling had not made him smaller or more cautious but more himself, and the man he was entirely was a good one. They sat on the porch one evening in the fall of 1888, with the orchard visible in the evening light from the porch of the ranch house that now had its leaking roof long since repaired, and a second room added, and a kitchen that Annie had reorganized twice and gotten right the third time, and the hill country was doing its October thing with the light coming golden through the cedar, and the air just cool enough to make sitting outside perfect. "Do you remember," Clayton said, "the first time you came into the office?" "You stood up when I came in," Annie said. "You put the promissory note on my desk like you were placing a chess piece," he said. "Like you had already worked out 3 moves ahead." "I had worked out 2, she said. He smiled. "You hadn't planned on me being one of the variables." "No," she said, with the warmth of someone telling a truth they are entirely glad of. "I had not planned on that. And now." She looked at him in the October evening light, this man who had stood up when she walked in, who had listened to her as a person with a problem rather than a situation to be managed, who had talked to her son about the dam like it was a real dam, who had kissed her on a hilltop with the morning sun on their backs and meant every word he had ever said to her. "And now I have everything I came to collect," she said, "and considerably more than I expected to find." He reached over and took her hand in the way he had been taking her hand for 6 years, with the certainty of someone who has found the right thing and intends to hold it. "I'm glad you walked in," he said. "So am I," she said. The cedar hills held them in the evening quiet, and the orchard grew in the dark below the ridge, and the house behind them was full of the sleeping sounds of children and the life that two people build when they are willing to be honest with each other and with themselves. And the Texas sky above them was the enormous and patient and brilliant sky of the hill country that had seen all of this before, and saw it still as the remarkable thing it always was. Two people finding each other in the middle of an ordinary life, and making it together into something that was anything but ordinary. The story of Annie Wells, who had walked into a sheriff's office in the summer of 1882 to collect what was owed her, did not end in that office. It ended here, and here, and here again, in the recurring present tense of a life fully lived, in the orchard growing patient on the East Hill, in Thomas's letters from College Station full of soil science and enthusiasm, in Robert James's firm convictions about ranching and Clara Ruth's ownership of the apple trees, in the conversations on the porch, and the books shared between them and the mornings that began with the particular gold light of the Texas hill country coming through the window and falling across the bed where Clayton Ford slept beside his wife with the easy trust of a man who is exactly where he has chosen to be. She had come for $115. She had left in the end with a life, and it was, she thought, on every morning that she woke into it, the very best exchange she had ever made.